Imagine you are in a luxury apartment in San Francisco. It is 1957. The air is thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of jazz playing on a mahogany phonograph. You have a drink in your hand, a martini, cold and crisp. There is a beautiful woman by your side, laughing at a joke you just made. For the first time in weeks, you feel at peace. You think you are alone in a world that finally makes sense. But look closer at the grain of this memory. Look at the wall. Behind that ornate, gold-framed mirror, there is a small, darkened room. And in that room, a man is sitting. He is wearing a federal suit, but he is sipping a martini of his own. He is holding a notepad. He is watching you through a two-way mirror, and he is waiting for your mind to dissolve. He isn't a burglar. He isn't a voyeur. He is a high-ranking agent of the Central Intelligence Agency. You weren't invited to this apartment for a party. You were lured here to be broken. You are currently part of the most unethical experiment in American history, and the government is paying for every drop of the LSD currently racing through your bloodstream. They didn't just watch you. They owned you. Why did the United States government turn a safe house into a house of horrors? How many average American men walked into 225 Chestnut Street and never truly walked back out? To find the truth, we have to look into the ashes. We have to find what the CIA tried so desperately to burn. The 1950s were not the Technicolor dream the history books sold us. Beneath the white picket fences and the neon diners, America was a nation vibrating with a singular, agonizing fear, brainwashing. The Korean War had ended with a terrifying realization. American POWs were coming home and praising the virtues of communism. They looked like the boys who left, but they spoke like puppets. The CIA was convinced that the Soviets and the Chinese had discovered a secret weapon for the mind, a way to erase a man's identity and replace it with a new, loyal ideology. In the windowless offices of the Lau Nam Gok and Langley, the panic was absolute. If the enemy could control the mind, then the war was already lost. The director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, issued a mandate that would change the course of history. He gave the green light for MKUltra. MKUltra was the umbrella. It was a massive, sprawling network of secret projects designed to find the holy grail of espionage, a truth serum, a mind-control drug, and a way to weaponize the human soul. They didn't care about ethics. They didn't care about the Hippocratic Oath. They only cared about results. But how do you test mind-control drugs in a way that remains invisible? You can't just drug people in a hospital, doctors ask too many questions. You can't do it on a military base, soldiers leave paper trails. You need a place where people expect to lose control. A place where the victims are too embarrassed to ever tell the police what happened. You need a safe house. And you need a man who has no soul left to lose. When the fear of being manipulated becomes a national obsession, does morality become a luxury we can no longer afford? The CIA was looking for a laboratory. But they didn't hire a scientist. They hired a hunter. Enter George Hunter White. If you saw him on the street, you might think he was a middle-aged accountant. But George White was a veteran of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and a man who had spent his life in the gutters of the world. He was a specialist in the dirty side of intelligence. He was a man who enjoyed the darkness a little too much. The CIA gave White a budget, a set of keys, and total immunity. His mission was codenamed Operation Midnight Climax. White chose San Francisco as his primary theater. In 1955, he rented an apartment at 225 Chestnut Street, right in the heart of the city's bohemian Telegraph Hill. On the surface, it was a high-end bachelor pad. It had French provincial furniture, silk curtains, and a fully stocked bar. But the walls told a different story. White had the CIA's Technical Services Division install state-of-the-art surveillance. Bugs in the lamps. Microphones in the headboards. And, most famously, the two-way mirrors in the bedroom and the living room. George White didn't sit in a lab coat. He sat in the observation room behind the mirror, often with a drink in his hand and a cigarette in his mouth. He would spend his nights watching the experiments unfold just inches away from him. He kept a diary. His entries weren't clinical, they were mocking. He viewed the people he drugged as insects. He once wrote in a letter to a colleague, "I was a very minor missionary, but I had a ball." Think about that. A federal officer, funded by your tax dollars, describing the systematic drugging and psychological torture of innocent citizens as having a ball. Why did the CIA give a man like George White the keys to a city? The plan was simple, and it was brutal. White hired a team of prostitutes. These women weren't just sex workers, they were CIA assets. Their job was to go to the bars and jazz clubs of San Francisco, find average men with wives, men with jobs, men with reputations, and lure them back to the apartment on Chestnut Street. Once inside, the women would offer the men a drink. But the bourbon and the gin were spiked with high-dose LSD. What happens to a man's reality when the drink in his hand becomes a gateway to a waking nightmare? And what kind of man finds joy in watching that world collapse from the safety of a dark room? The trap was set. The first patient was about to walk through the door of 225 Chestnut Street. And George White was already behind the mirror, waiting for the climax to begin. The patients of Operation Midnight Climax didn't arrive in ambulances. They arrived in the back of yellow cabs, laughing, often a bit tipsy, led by the hand of a woman they had met only an hour before. To these men, this was the ultimate lucky break. A beautiful woman, a high-end apartment, and a cabinet full of the best liquor money could buy. They had no idea they were walking onto a stage where the script had already been written in blood and chemicals. George White's siren strategy was ruthlessly efficient. He hired women who knew how to navigate the shadows of the city. He didn't just pay them, he trained them. They were taught how to lead a man to a specific chair. They knew exactly which glass had been prepared by the technical division. They were the frontline soldiers in a war against the American mind, and their weapon was a small, tasteless drop of liquid. Imagine the amber glow of a high-end bourbon under the soft light of a desk lamp. It looks perfect. It looks like a reward. But hidden in that alcohol is a massive dose of LSD, often 5 or 10 times the amount a modern researcher would consider safe. Within 20 minutes, the walls of the safe house would begin to breathe. The French provincial furniture would start to melt into the floor. The jazz on the phonograph would turn into a screaming chorus of metallic echoes. For the victim, the world didn't just change, it disintegrated. And all the while, the woman who brought him there would keep him in the room, keep him in the light, and keep him in front of the mirror. Behind that mirror, the scratch of a fountain pen on paper was the only sound. George White and his team weren't looking for medical data. They weren't checking heart rates or pupil dilation for the sake of science. They were looking for the breaking point. They were testing sexual blackmail. They were observing how a drugged man reacts to suggestion, to fear, and to the loss of his own ego. How do you tell your wife, your boss, or your priest that you were drugged by the government in a brothel you didn't know was a laboratory? The CIA knew that the shame was the perfect cloak for their crimes. They chose men who had everything to lose because they knew those men would never dare to speak the truth. If the state can manipulate your reality in a bedroom, where else are they watching? Are we ever truly safe in a house built by the government? The observation room at 225 Chestnut Street was a masterpiece of cold, clinical voyeurism. It was small, cramped, and smelled of the heavy tobacco George White favored. While the victim in the next room was experiencing the most terrifying or confusing moments of his life, the agents behind the glass were often bored. They treated the psychological destruction of human beings like a dull shift at a factory. But George White was never bored. His diaries from this period are a window into a truly disturbing mind. He wrote about the performances he witnessed with a sense of dark satisfaction. He wasn't just a bureaucrat following orders, he was a man who enjoyed the power of the God view. He could see everything, but he could not be seen. He held the lives of these men in his hand, and he watched them crumble for the sheer sport of it. The CIA's Technical Services Division provided the equipment. They had state-of-the-art tape recorders that captured every groan, every cry for help, and every whispered secret. This wasn't just about mind control, it was about data mining the human soul. They wanted to know if they could use LSD to make a foreign diplomat confess. They wanted to see if they could use sex to discredit a political enemy. They were using American citizens as disposable training dummies for a global game of blackmail. And it was all funded by you. Every silk sheet, every bottle of top-shelf gin, and every dose of high-purity acid was paid for by the American taxpayer. Operation Midnight Climax was perhaps the only government program where the citizens paid for the privilege of being drugged and watched by their own protectors. When science is stripped of ethics, does it remain science, or does it simply become a sophisticated form of assault? Does the greater good ever justify the systematic destruction of an innocent man's sanity? As the San Francisco operation proved to be a success in the eyes of the CIA, George White decided it was time to scale up. He wanted a bigger stage. He wanted a city with more secrets, more power, and more victims. He looked east, toward the flickering lights of New York City. In the late 1950s, George White brought the Midnight Climax model to Manhattan. He rented a safe house on West 80th Street, a brownstone that looked like any other high-end residence in the city. But the New York operation was even more aggressive. The stakes were higher. The city was a sea of powerful men, bankers, politicians, and media moguls, all of whom were potential targets for the God view. The New York safe house became a factory for secrets. The CIA began testing even more dangerous combinations of drugs, mixing LSD with barbiturates, with alcohol, and with hypnotic suggestion. They were trying to find a way to create a blackout state where a man would perform an action, perhaps even a crime, and have no memory of it the next morning. The goal was the Manchurian Candidate in real life. They wanted to know if they could program a human being like a machine. And to do it, they turned New York's nightlife into a hunting ground. George White would roam the clubs of Greenwich Village, looking for new talent to bring back to 80th Street. He was the king of a secret kingdom built on the ruins of human dignity. But as the 1960s began to roar, the scale of MKUltra began to leak. The sheer number of people involved, the prostitutes, the technicians, the agents, made the secret too heavy to carry. George White eventually retired, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and a filing cabinet full of the most disturbing records in American history. If the files for Operation Midnight Climax still exist, they would likely name some of the most prominent men of the 20th century. But as we will see, the CIA had a plan for those files. They knew that if the public ever saw what George White saw through that mirror, the agency wouldn't survive the fallout. If you believe that the Midnight Climax was just the beginning of a much larger web of surveillance, join the archive by hitting the subscribe button. We decode the shadows so you don't have to stay in the dark. If you have nothing to hide, you don't reach for the matches. In the winter of 1973, the halls of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, didn't smell like victory or Cold War strategy. They smelled like smoke. The director of the CIA, Richard Helms, had looked at the political landscape of a post-Watergate America and realized that the era of absolute secrecy was ending. The sun was beginning to shine into the darkest corners of the agency, and the files of MKUltra were the first things that needed to disappear. Helms issued a verbal order, a command that would haunt historians for decades. He ordered the systematic destruction of every record, every tape, and every diary related to the mind control programs. This was the Great Purge. Imagine the scene in the basement of the CIA. Men in suits feeding decades of human suffering into heavy-duty industrial shredders and high-temperature incinerators. Every recorded scream from the safe houses of San Francisco, every desperate confession from the 80th Street brownstone, and every clinical note on the destruction of a man's ego was turned into ash. They didn't just burn paper, they burned the evidence of a decade of crimes against the American people. They destroyed the names of the victims. They erased the identities of the sirens. They tried to make it so that Operation Midnight Climax never existed. What was so terrifying in those files that the director of the CIA risked a federal crime just to keep you from reading them? What were the details that even the God view couldn't handle once the lights were turned on? The fire burned for days. By the time the investigators from the Church Committee arrived in 1975, there was almost nothing left but the smell of burnt ink and a few boxes of misfiled documents that had escaped the flames by sheer luck. The CIA thought they had silenced the ghosts of 225 Chestnut Street forever. They believed that without a paper trail, there was no crime. When the Church Committee finally began its hearings, the American public was forced to confront a reality that felt like science fiction. They heard about the Midnight Climax. They heard about the two-way mirrors and the spiked martinis. But because the files had been burned, the investigators could only offer a fragment of the truth. The most baffling, the most tragic, part of the revelation wasn't the drugs or the sex. It was the survivors. There were hundreds of men who had walked into those safe houses and walked out with their minds fractured. They didn't know why they had experienced terrifying hallucinations. They didn't know why they had lost hours of their lives. They had lived for years with the shame, the confusion, and the lingering paranoia, believing they had simply suffered a mental breakdown. Now, decades later, they were finding out that they had been lab rats for a government experiment they never signed up for. But because the records were destroyed, most of these men could never prove they were there. They could never claim compensation. They could never even get a formal apology. Can you imagine the feeling of realizing that the nightmare you lived through was actually a billion-dollar government program? How do you regain your trust in the world when you find out your own protectors were the ones holding the syringe? The CIA offered a few regrets. They admitted that the experiments were unethical. But they never released the names of the victims they had left in the shadows. The survivors were left with nothing but their broken memories and the knowledge that the people who watched them through the glass had moved on to high-ranking positions in the government. If this level of betrayal makes you question the very foundation of the headlines you see today, join the Hidden Pulse archive. We decode the shadows so you don't have to stay in the dark. Subscribe and help us keep the memory of the victims alive. Here is the final twist that will keep you awake tonight. Operation Midnight Climax didn't end because the government found its conscience. It ended because the technology for control evolved. The God view of George White, sitting behind a mirror with a martini and a notepad, was limited. It required a physical location. It required expensive drugs and risky sirens. But in the 21st century, the CIA doesn't need to lure you into a safe house at 225 Chestnut Street. Your smartphone is the new safe house. Every piece of data you generate, every search, every like, every private message, is a two-way mirror. The God view has been digitized. They don't need LSD to see how you react to a stimulus. They have algorithms that can trigger your fear, your anger, and your desires with surgical precision. The useful outcry that the generals wanted in 1962 is now manufactured every day on your social media feed. The logic of George White is alive and well in the code of our digital lives. The desire to watch, to manipulate, and to break the human mind hasn't changed. Only the tools have become invisible. They don't need to burn the files anymore because the data is so vast and so complex that the truth is buried under a mountain of noise. Are you sure you are standing in a world of free will? Or are you just sitting in a digital room with silk curtains and jazz music, unaware that someone is taking notes on the other side of the screen? We look back at the grain of these 35mm photos and we feel a sense of distant shock. We pity the men who walked into that San Francisco apartment. But perhaps we should pity ourselves more. The men of Midnight Climax at least had a chance to walk out the door. In the digital age, there is no door. Operation Midnight Climax was the peak of MKUltra's madness, a moment when the state decided that the human soul was just a commodity to be traded for an edge in the Cold War. They burned the records to save themselves, but they couldn't burn the precedent they set. The past isn't a museum, it's a blueprint. And the blueprint for the Midnight Climax is still being used to build the world we live in right now. If this journey into the ashes of the CIA's dark history changed how you see the safehouses in your own life, stay with us. Subscribe to the archive and share this deep dive. History only repeats itself when we forget to look through the mirror. I'm your host for Hidden Pulse. The file on Operation Midnight Climax is now closed. Until the next archive opens. Stay vigilant.